You're listening to the Quint's podcast.
More than 3 years after the Catholic Church was rocked by rape allegations, in a shock judgment on 14 January, the Additional District and Sessions Court in Kottayam acquitted ex-Bishop Franco Mulakkal of rape charges filed against him by a 46-year-old nun. In a 289-page verdict, Additional Sessions Judge G Gopakumar held the victim's statement as quote-unquote inconsistent and that quote-unquote the prosecution has failed to give a proper explanation for the inconsistent version. However, the verdict saw some bizarre reasoning to arrive at this conclusion, from an inexplicable dismissal of important disclosures by the survivor to other nuns, to calling the primary supporting witness in the case quote-unquote unreliable. In her allegation, the survivor stated that the bishop has raped her 13 times between 2014 and 2016. However, what followed was a harrowing experience both inside and outside the court for the survivor and the nuns who came out to support her. And the way the trial had gone about, with multiple witnesses brought forward by the prosecution who supported the survivor's testimony, Kerala Police's thorough investigation of the case, the final verdict outraged not only women activists, but also the legal community given the several loopholes in the judgment. In today's episode, we are going to take a look at the judgment and what the reasoning it gives for acquitting Bishop Franco and why it is problematic. Joining me today to unpack the verdict is Vakasha Sasdev, the Quint's legal editor, and Sister Lucy Kalapura, who had supported the survivor from the start. You're tuned in to The Big Story, the podcast where we dissect the headline-making news for you, and I'm your host, Himmat. Before we dive into the verdict, here is a short recap of the case. In June 2018, a 43-year-old nun from Kerala, also the Mother Superior belonging to the Missionaries of Jesus congregation based in Punjab, had filed a police complaint in Kottayam claiming that Bishop Franco, the former head of the Latin Catholic Diocese in Jalandhar, had raped her several times between 2014 and 2016. After several long days of protest under the banner of quote-unquote Seva Sisters by nuns and several women organizations, Bishop Franco was arrested on 21 September 2018. During this time, Pope Francis also relieved Franco of his pastoral duties. However, just a month later on 15th October, Bishop Franco was granted bail by the Kerala High Court. While the trial began in November 2019, it got challenged multiple times by Franco, who took it all the way to the Supreme Court as well. While the battle inside the court was taking place, the survivor and the nuns supporting her faced a lot of backlash from the community. Sisters Anupama Kelamangaluthu Veliel, Nina Rose, Josephine Villu Nikkal, Ansita Urumbil, and Alfie Pallasheril, residing at the St. Francis Mission Home in Kerala's Kottayam district, have been shunned away from the congregation for supporting the survivor. And when the verdict for the case came on 14 January, Sister Lucy Kalapura, who has been supporting the survivor from the start and was also expelled from the Franciscan Claris Congregation FCC, labelled it as quote-unquote illegal, unfair and atrocious.
ഫ്രാങ്കോ കേസിന്റെ വിധി verdict ശരിക്കും പിന്നെ കോടതിയിൽ ദൈവത്തിന്റെ നീതി അല്ലെങ്കിൽ നീതിയുടെ ദേവത അവിടെ കരഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ട് എന്നാണ് ഞാൻ വിശ്വസിക്കുന്നത്. അല്ലെങ്കിൽ അവിടെ നീതി നിഷേധിക്കപ്പെട്ടു. അതിന്റെ വലിയ വേദനയുണ്ട്. സത്യത്തിലെ പ്രതിയെ രക്ഷപ്പെടുത്താൻ വേണ്ടി ഇരയ്ക്ക് വേണ്ടി കുറ്റങ്ങൾ കണ്ടെത്തുന്ന ഒരു പ്രക്രിയ പോലെയാണ് ആ 289 പേജുള്ള ആ വിധിവാചകങ്ങളിൽ മുഴുവനും.
We are very hurt. This judgment sounds like it was written to protect the accused by finding fault with the survivor. She's a helpless nun who stood up against the highest authority of the church. And for that, she faced a lot of backlash. And she had to relive that horrific rape counter again and again in the court. As a common person who expected to get justice, this judgment has come as a shocker. When we are exploited like this, when a person is exploited, then she loses all hope to live a regular life. If this is how the court treats us, then should all the women live in fear all the time? I stand in solidarity with the sisters. Justice is not reserved for only a few who have money and power. It is for everybody. A nun is also an Indian citizen. The Indian Constitution guarantees rights and freedom to everyone. We know that this society believes in our truth, and we are all with the survivor.
അവകാശം നിഷേധിക്കപ്പെടുകയാണ് ചെയ്യുന്നത്. അവിടെയാണ് നമ്മൾ രാജ്യത്തിന്റെ നിയമവ്യവസ്ഥിതിയെ ആശ്രയിക്കുന്നത്. അപ്പോൾ ഇങ്ങനെ ഈ കേസിൽ ഇത്രയും അന്യായപരമായിട്ട് വിധി വന്നപ്പോൾ നമ്മളൊക്കെ ഇനി എങ്ങനെയാണ് നമ്മുടെ ഇത്തരത്തിലുള്ള സ്ത്രീകൾ, പെൺകുട്ടികൾ ഒക്കെ നേരിടുന്ന പ്രതിസന്ധികളിൽ നീതിപീഠത്തെ സമീപിക്കുക? ഭയപ്പാടെയല്ലേ സമീപിക്കാൻ പറ്റുള്ളൂ ഇനി. അങ്ങനെയാണെങ്കിൽ നീതിപീഠത്തിൽ പോലും പോകണ്ട. ഇതൊക്കെ നമ്മൾ അടിമകളെ.
Let's now move to the judgment itself and what makes it so problematic. To make it simpler for our listeners' comprehension, I will divide this segment of the episode into 5 parts, detailing the problems additional Sessions Judge G Gopakumar found with the case, and at the end of each part, the Quint's legal editor Vakasha Sasdev will weigh in on why that particular judgment is problematic. The first 2 problems are related, so I'll club them together. The first problem. The court noted that the delay in filing a complaint by the survivor, where it said that while the sexual violence took place between May 2014 and September 2016, the complaint was only filed in June 2018. The second problem was that the court's view of the victim made to quote-unquote share a bed with Bishop Franco. The court also noted in its judgment that in the initial disclosures to church figures in 2017, the survivor did not specifically mention that she was subjected to sexual violence, and that in a letter in May 2018, the survivor did not specify that she was raped 13 times. These kind of inconsistency, according to the court, discredit the survivor's credibility. However, Vakasha says that a delay in filing the complaint should not be considered fatal to the case. He expands on that the key witnesses brought forward by the prosecution also support the survivor's testimony.
So let's sort of go over these issues one by one. I mean, now the thing is, the fact that the court actually clearly points out that under law, when it comes to rape complaints, there can be a delay, and that the delay in filing a complaint should not be considered fatal to the case. And on this point, once the court has said that, you'd think that it's going to then not allow any questions of, oh, why is there a delay here come into play? But it's bizarre that the court continuously keeps doing that. And it does that on a bunch of very problematic assumptions. Because what the court says is that, okay, fine, there can be a delay when these kind of things happen. In a rape case, especially given the nature of the offense, this can be there. But then what is important for the court to look at is if there were contemporaneous points where the survivor spoke to other people, talked to them about the assault, so that so even though there's a delay, there have been people who at that time were made aware of it. So that kind of shows that this isn't just something which is being made up later down the line. Now, the thing is that there are these disclosures by the survivor to specific witnesses who were the key witnesses for the prosecution. But the court discredits each of them, and for very, very problematic reasons. The biggest reason which the court has, and it's just bizarre, is that the court says that that according to what the survivor said in her testimony, according to what these witnesses have said, that at the time, so beginning with one person who she told in December 2014, so while the assaults were still going on when they had started in May 2014, continued as she says afterwards. In December 2014, she told her spiritual mother, prosecution witness to Sister Lissy. Then after that, in 2016, in September, again just soon after the last sort of assault took place, she told 2 other nuns that about this. But now the language she used, and this is what the court takes objection to, is that she says she was forced to share a bed with this priest. This is the same language she uses even when she again supposedly speaks to a bishop who she knew well in the church. Now the court says that this language of sharing a bed is not enough to say that she was disclosing sexual violence to them, which is just utterly bizarre. I mean, if you look at it even from a common layperson's perspective, that is a perfectly normal way to describe it. And especially when you look at it, that this is a nun who has taken vows of chastity. There's so many other issues of being from a conservative background, etc., etc. So many things here. It's completely legitimate that she didn't want to obviously explain the exact details of what happened to her, and has used this term, which conveys the message entirely. And yet the court then says, oh, so therefore we can't. Therefore, there aren't enough contemporary disclosures, and therefore delay becomes an issue. which I mean, it's so on the so not only is the court let delay come into play, it's then had a problem and said that the delay is a problem based on a very inexplicable idea of what a disclosure about a sexual violence act is supposed to be. So it just makes no sense what the court has done here, and it's allowing it to what it's doing is it's doing something which, because of this, it's letting this potential delay in filing the complaint become fatal to the case, even though it itself had acknowledged that it's not supposed to be doing.
Third problem, that the court said that the prosecution failed to produce digital evidence such as mobiles, laptops, that will help corroborate the allegation that the accused used to send obscene messages to the victim. Vakasha believes that while the court is entirely correct in scrutinizing these issues and that these were indeed some errors from the side of the prosecution, the court's observations don't deal with the evidence or issues that were actually relevant to the crux of the case.
So look, there is a standard issue which keeps happening, which we have to acknowledge can happen in a criminal law case, is that if the police or the prosecution make mistakes, so either the collection of the evidence or the presentation of evidence in certain forms, if certain formalities and procedural aspects are not followed, that can be fatal to even a case which, looks like it's absolutely strong. And if that happens, you can't really say that the court has done something wrong if they acquit a person. Because at the end of the day, that is what a court is meant to do. It has to look at these kind of procedural things. They may seem nitpicky, they may seem like a problem, but at the end of the day, in criminal law, you have to prove things beyond reasonable doubt. So it is understandable if a court acquits someone because those procedures aren't followed, because that's the kind of bedrock of ensuring that the law is followed, that you don't have convictions of innocent people. Like, procedures meant to help that, even though it can seem formalistic and technical and unnecessarily problematic. But the thing is, now there certainly seem to be some problems with what the police and the prosecution have done here. There's some basic errors which have been made about, especially about getting the sort of certificates for digital evidence. Where they're saying, okay, we've got this on an email or we've got this from a website. You are required to submit these certificates under the Evidence Act, which does not appear to have been done. For some of the key things here, like there are receipts for the letters and about the complaints which she sent to people in the church before she filed her police complaint. Now, so the fact that the police have not done those things, I mean, yes, that's a problem. But what is strange is that the court brings up certain other aspects and says that, oh, they didn't submit relevant evidence or they didn't do things, which is not entirely quite so clear. Because now, for instance, they say that why was the mobile phone and the laptop of the survivor not submitted? Why was the mobile phone for her cousin and her husband, who are involved with this because of the complaint which the cousin filed against her, which is separate to this, but is then argued to be the reasoning behind all of this. All of these, they say that why were these devices, not seized? Why were copies not submitted to the court, etc., etc., etc. Now, that is, on paper, that would seem relevant, but that's not entirely relevant to the issue at hand here, because while there is a mention that there were some messages sent by Mulakkal to the survivor, that's not really central to this case at all. And as regards the complaint by her cousin, and her cousin's husband, the messages which are supposed to be involved in that whole situation there, that's not relevant because that's not proved. So if the prosecution is not making that a core part of their argument, because in fact it was the cousin who actually told the court that the complaint was false, once that was the case, there was no need to delve any more into those messages or into any of those issues. So for the court to say that the prosecution should have done that doesn't really make a lot of sense. Yes, there have been some procedural problems with what the prosecution did. Maybe they should have got the phone, but at the end of the day, many people don't keep their phones beyond a point. And you can't necessarily draw an adverse inference unless that was crucial or central to the prosecution case, which it really wasn't here. So, these kind of observations being there and being made to are then used by the court to make it look like the prosecution's done something really bad here, which, as I said, can very often be the case. And there are some flaws also with what the prosecution, the police did here. But those aren't relevant or do not deal with the crux of the case and should not therefore be part of the reason why the court has to acquit Mulakkal.
The fourth problem, the character assassination of the complainant nun, where the court went into the survivor's private life. And the court does this by dissecting a letter by the survivor's cousin Jaya, who alleged that the former indulged in sexual intercourse with her husband. This therefore offered a different explanation to the medical findings of the investigation. And though Jaya, who deposed before the court and said that the petition was false and was given in the backdrop of a family feud, the court refused to consider this. The court said, and I quote, even if it is assumed that the complaint was a false complaint, from the mere fact that the victim's hymen was found torn, penile penetration or forceful sexual intercourse cannot be inferred. End quote. Wakasha weighs in on how the court in his judgment used this complaint to cast a shadow on the survivor, thus further discrediting her testimony.
So one of the things is that to an extent, this doesn't do the kind of character assassination that, say, we saw in the Tarun Tejpal judgment, or at least explicitly it doesn't do it. But what this judgment does is that I mean, yes, the court has to look at all the factors, and including what the defense is arguing, including the theories which are put out there by them to kind of argue against it, which create doubt about the survivor's testimony. Because at the end of the day, here, the key evidence is the survivor's testimony. You have to really look at whether her testimony is of sterling enough quality that you can convict a person on the basis of this. Now, her character is not relevant to it, but there are ways in which this can be used to discredit aspects of the testimony. Now, that's not done here in a way like where we saw the kind of language we saw in the Tarun Tejpal verdict, where there was almost an express kind of thing about her being a woman of, who was of loose models or whatever, and and the way it kind of tried to portray her sex life and her personal private life as things against her. Now, that's not been done here, but the court does some very strange things in the judgment which implicitly are casting a shadow on her. And key to that is the way in which it looks at the complaint filed by her cousin against her, which I've already mentioned. Now, the thing about that complaint was, it said, according to the cousin of the survivor, she wrote a complaint to the church saying that this one has been having an affair with my husband, and kind of and that she was, because of that affair, the husband was even contemplating suicide. There's also and to corroborate it, she supposedly gave facts about things which are on the complainant's body, or the knowledge which the husband could have only known if he was having an intimate affair with the survivor. Now, the thing is that if you the first thing to remember is, as we said, that the survivor's cousin Jaya actually told the court that she filed that complaint as a false complaint. It was not true. She had a personal issue with the cousin and with her husband, and that was why she filed this. Now, the thing is, in fact, even in that letter, it starts by her saying that the survivor sent her text message complaining about her husband's inappropriate messages. Now, once so even within that context, it's clear that there is not that it's the survivor who was bringing something up here. But leaving aside any of the details of that complaint, the issue is that once she's saying that it's a false complaint, it's not relevant unless key aspects of that complaint are proved to the court, whether through other people's testimony or through evidence submitted by the defense, not by the prosecution, including for instance, the messages which are supposedly involved. That complaint should be of no use. In fact, the court has this huge section talking about a breast examination and all, which was supposed to corroborate what was in that complaint. And actually, that breast examination actually doesn't corroborate what was said in the complaint. And yet, at the end of this all, the court is still saying, this complaint is relevant, casts doubt on things, and therefore it becomes part of its whole reasoning as to why it can't separate the grain from the chaff, and therefore it can't determine what exactly is whether the survivor story is entirely true, and therefore it has to acquit Mulakkal. So it's bizarre that it gives so much weightage to this complaint, which is essentially something which is trying to attack the character of the survivor, even though that complaint was said by the complainant to be false. And the one aspect of it which could actually be proved was shown to be false. Everything else is just speculation, is just because the relevant things which could have proved it true or false weren't brought up. But that wasn't something the prosecution had to do, which the court for some reason says it had to do. And so at the end of the day, it's very, very strange that this is then relied on to the extent it is by the court to cast doubt on the survivor's version. So this is another huge problem.
And last, are the allegations that the survivor had a close relationship with Bishop Franco. The court in its judgment notes emails and photographs that showed the survivor had a close interaction with the accused. The court said, and I quote, she was the chief advisor of the bishop in all appointments, and sometimes those appointments were made overruling the decision of the general council. End quote. Vakasha says that by making this observation, the court has failed to acknowledge the church hierarchy and the fear of retaliation by Bishop Franco and the church against the nuns if any disturbance was caused.
So there are two things which I'm going to kind of look at here. One is the way it kind of said that the survivor has given inconsistent testimony, and the allegations that she had a close association with the bishop even after these acts of violence. Because this is again a very standard thing which is done in sexual violence cases, where the point is where, oh, but you were with the person afterwards, or oh, you talked to them afterwards, and things were fine. But unless and until there's communication saying that okay, that any sexual acts were consensual, it's unclear why that should be relevant. Like, you have to look at social context, which in this case, for instance, involved, and this is again, it's so bizarre. The court acknowledges that there are public functions and things which the survivor then attended the very next day with Mulakkal, which is used to say that, oh, she is used to try and infer that she didn't have a problem with what he was doing. But if there were functions which she had to attend, given the nature, anyway, this person was someone who had authority over that congregation of nuns, who had authority over the convent. How could she not do it? So how on earth are you saying that the fact that she attended things is events with him afterwards, or continued to speak to him afterwards, or even traveled in a car with him afterwards, that this is a reason to doubt her testimony? And the thing is, the reason why I've sort of clubbed this with the court's general comment about her testimony being inconsistent is because it's like almost this attempt by the court to find ways to say that her testimony is inconsistent, even though that doesn't really back up what it's trying to say. And this is what we see in the rest of the judgment as well. Like, the key issue why the court says that it finds her version is inconsistent is that it says, look, when she filed her written complaint with the police, the first information statement, as it's called, in September 2018, in June 2018, at that point of time, she did not state that there was penetrative sort of penile sex with the accused. And it says that, even when you look at her medical examination, when she's asked to give the medical history of it, she doesn't tell the doctor there that, okay, there was penetrative sex. And that's initially, and so interestingly, that's in the initial medical examination that was specifically written down. But then that was later changed by the police because in her subsequent additional statement to the police, she said, look, on the first occasion, there was no penetrative penile sex, but on the other 12 occasions afterwards, there was. Now, the fact that she didn't disclose it in that first information statement or in the initial thing to the doctor can be explained by a lot of the social factors there. One, this is a person who's a nun. She's sworn a vow of chastity. It's very uncomfortable for her to talk about this, even when acknowledging that there was, for instance, there were certain acts of a sexual nature on her. Penetrative sex becomes a violation of that vow, which basically is, even if it's against her will, it's essentially a death knell for her as being a nun. So even though she may want to file that criminal complaint, there is a huge psychosocial issue here behind her being able to even talk about it. On top of that was the fact that where she was recording the first information statement was not at a police station or in a completely secluded area. It was in the parlor of the convent itself. So even though, yes, there were not supposed to be any other nuns in the room, it's possible that they could have heard. So she was very uncomfortable. She was, in any case, she also says she wasn't very comfortable with the woman police officer who was taking a statement, which is, by the way, something which women around this country who are trying to who try to make a complaint about sexual violence constantly face, a hostile attitude from the police. They're trying to make that complaint too. So what you're looking at is very valid reasons for why she wasn't able to maybe tell the full story at the start. And she's explained all of this in her testimony. Her section 164 statement, which is where she's, what she's giving under oath to a magistrate, includes this detail. Her additional statement to the police includes this detail. The statement she's made, the testimony she's sworn to in court includes all of this. So and her stance, by the way, is very consistent. So, her description of what happened on the first occasion on 5th May 2014, whether you're looking at that first information statement, whether you're looking at what happened later, is, for instance, absolutely clear. Like, she does not say that there was penetrative penile sex in this, but she does mention that he inserted his fingers into her vagina. There's the fact that he tried to make her perform oral sex, then he used her hands. Now, these things already constitute an act of rape. They already constitute an act of rape. So, even if we assume that the other 12 instances, there are inconsistencies about it, there is no inconsistency with what she said happened the first time on 5th May 2014. And therefore, if all you can say is that, okay, that was the one incident something happened, then that should be fine. And the court doesn't seem to have a problem with that initial part of what she says. But because of its other problems with her inconsistency, it then discards everything she has said, which is not just seems unfair, but even if we go by the law and the way this is supposed to happen in the courts, what the courts have said about, dealing with inconsistencies in testimony, that's wrong. Because if at all we have to acknowledge that maybe there are some inconsistencies, then the court can maybe say, okay, we can't be sure on what happened on the other 12 occasions, but we can be sure about what happened on the first occasion because that testimony has remained consistent, despite when you're saying that there are changes or whatever. What you're looking at then again is the court trying to find a way to say that her testimony is inconsistent, even though on every other aspect it's quite rock solid. Her version doesn't change. She's explained to you the context behind why she didn't give full information earlier. And that explanation fits perfectly within the sort of social framework here of who she is, the hierarchical nature of the church, which she was part of, all of that. And yet the court just the way it dismisses what she said, her explanation is so cavalier. There's almost no attempt to really engage with it. The first part about not being able to tell the police person, the court just dismissed it without even any real reasoning. It talks about it in 2 occasions, but it doesn't really explain why it's dismissing it. And then the second part about the fact that she was worried that people in the convent would hear her, it just again dismisses it by saying, oh, but the Mother Superior had said she was not going to allow anyone in the room. But people can hear if they're listening at the door. They could be outside. And again, remember, you're forgetting the context behind all of this. This is a nun in a convent talking about sexual assault, which is, it's anathema to someone to do that. So, the way the court has, it's like it's just decided to not take an empathetic view or take a view where it tries to understand what's happened there and just dismisses things in this quest almost to find that her testimony is inconsistent.
The 5 points in the judgment show that the court did not acknowledge the testimony of the survivor and the witnesses in the case, and the lengths it goes to cast doubt on the survivor's testimony. So, what's next? The prosecution has decided to move an appeal against the verdict in the High Court. According to a Wire report, the appeal will point to the shortfalls in the judgment. If you want to read more on this story, Vakasha wrote a detailed article breaking down the judgment. You'll find a link to that article in our show notes. To stay tuned with the story, follow the Quint on our social media handles. If you liked listening to this episode, please subscribe to The Big Story for episodic updates. We're available on Apple, Google Podcasts, Spotify, JioSaavn, and most of the other popular podcast streaming platforms. For other podcasts, please log on to the Quint website, and for any feedback, please shoot an email to podcast@thequint.com.
Thanks for listening. Log on to the Quint's website and check out our other podcasts.